Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiMitSpez22.com, Podbean podcast, and YouTube video. I'm Dr. Larry Chapp. I'm very excited today to have with me Dr. Shaun Blanchard, and we'll get to his particulars in a second. I just want to say, if I happen to fall out of my chair, I've said this to you before, then you will understand because I am suffering from vertigo. My
Oh,
usual,
I'm sorry,
yeah,
Larry.
I'm sorry to say that I had to actually cancel a podcast I had last night with Peter McGregor, who is an Australian, another person from Australia who had a communal article. And the vertigo was just too extreme and I couldn't do it. It's better this morning. And it's just something I suffer from time to time. But if I seem a bit off, if my eyes are, then please, the viewers will understand. Anyway, all that housekeeping out of the way. I am very, very delighted to be joined. I think this is the second time I've had you on the show, Shaun. I believe you
Third,
were on once
third
before.
total. There was
Oh,
one, it
okay.
was just me, and then once with Steven. We were talking about the Vatican II
That's
book.
right. That's right. Stephen Boulevard, who I adore that guy. He is just hysterical as well as brilliant. But anyway, we're here to talk today. Oh, by the way, so Dr. Shaun Blanchard, he teaches at the University of Notre Dame in Australia. Although he's not Australian. Are you from North Carolina originally?
I am. I am. That's right.
Yes. So you like Carolina barbecue, as do I, which is the
Er,
superior barbecue.
I absolutely love it. But North Carolina also has a fine theological pedigree. We have Matthew Levering, Jenny Martin, and John Shelby Spahn. So we
Not to be
cover
confused with one another. I just saw
we cover
Jennifer
the whole
Martin. I just saw Jenny Martin, who I also love. I interviewed her latest book on Balthasar and the influence of the Russian sociologist on Balthasar. I think is just brilliant. I met her husband, Jay Martin. My wife and I, Carrie, went to a conference at Notre Dame, the Catholic Imagination Conference. It was run by the Nicola Center. If you get a chance to go to any of the Nicola Center fall conferences, run, don't walk to do so. A magnificent conference. But I did meet Jenny. I didn't realize she was from North Carolina. That's great.
She's a
So,
convert from rural North Carolina. Yeah, Jenny and Jay are very dear friends of mine. They're just fantastic people.
and okay, Dr. Blanchard is the author of many books, but we're going to be talking today about Jansenism. And he has a new book out today, co-edited by with Richard Yoder, who is a doctoral student at Penn State University, Shaun Blanchard and Richard Yoder. And this is primarily a translation of and a collection of original source documents. It's called Early Modern Catholic Sources, Jansenism, an international anthology, in which, sort of for the first time, brought under one cover, is a series of documents from so-called Jansenists from 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and it's really just breathtaking in its expansiveness. But there's also about a 60-page introduction at the very beginning that gives a brief history of Jansenism that is almost worth the price of the entire book. Just that brief introduction. And the reason why I thought it important to talk about this book, when it came out, I immediately emailed Shaun, so we have to talk about this book. Because Jansenism, right? Jansenism is one of those terms that we all think we know what it means. And we throw it around rather liberally when we say, oh, that dude's a Jansenist, which simply means he's a Catholic that's been eating green lemons his whole life and is just a big sourpuss and hates everything good and doesn't want anybody to have any fun, a real stick in the mud. That's a and obviously has a hang up about all naughty bits and sex and so forth. All right, we don't want anything to do our naughty bits. That's a Jansenist Catholic. And growing up,
You're channeling Stephen Bullivant here.
that's I am. That's right. I am Stephen. If you're listening, yeah, exactly. A bit of Monty Python too, because they were always about naughty bits. And I just remember growing up and then going to seminary being told that the problem with American Catholicism is it's the product of Irish Jansenism. And I thought, yeah, that's right. That's right. It's Irish Jansenism. Although I never bothered to actually try and figure out what in the heck Jansenism actually is. So, Dr. Blanchard, please introduce us to the topic, if you will. What is Jansenism a real thing? If it is, what is it? And sort of launch into the conversation here.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So it's good. It's a big question. We in the anthology, Rick and I, so the co-editor Rick Yoder, who's a fantastic young scholar, and he's actually in France right now working in archives on the convulsionaire movement, which we might speak about later, but a kind of
Okay.
charismatic, ecstatic, uh, unhinged in many ways revival movement
Oh, wow.
in the 18th century. So kind of like a Catholic Great Awakening that got really, really dark of people beating each other and all kinds of strange things. But anyway, fascinating movement. Anyway, Rick and I argue, yes, Jansenism is a real thing. We recognize that some scholars prefer to speak of Jansenisms. They prefer to kind of pluralize it the same way that some scholars might speak of enlightenments. And they'll talk about the Scottish
Yeah.
Enlightenment and whatever, the Enlightenment in Tuscany. And these are actually separate movements. We speak about Jansenism, but we recognize the fact that you could argue a kind of second generation of Jansenism is rooted in the first generation, but really takes on a completely new coloring due to the political theological shifts that go on. So it's a real thing. Rick has a wonderful pithy line. So he wrote most the first section here, and he talks about it. I think it's bottom of page three, top of page, or it's top of page four. He says Jansenism began as a tendency and ended as a tradition. So
Yeah.
it
I
began.
underlined that.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's when he put that in the draft because we were passing this thing back and forth. I said, "That's brilliant. Nail that to the wall."
I
That's
always underline stuff that I think is a brilliant way of putting things, a brilliant piece of writing, because then I try to emulate it without plagiarizing it because it's
yeah,
illiterate. It's alliterative, but it's also completely accurate. It's a tendency that became a tradition. That's just simply brilliant writing, and it's
it
absolutely
is.
true.
Yeah, I would suspect most of the things you underlined were written by Rick because he's a really so I'm still kind of early career. I'm like on the edge of early to middle career, but I'm already attaching myself to the most talented people that I can find. So Ulrich Lehner, Rick Yoder. So it's a tendency, it's a set of tendencies. One of them is rigorism, certainly is moral rigorism,
Yeah.
and that would have been nailed into
Okay,
your
let's
head.
yeah, let's stop there. So that's the one that I think most people are familiar with, moral
Right.
rigorism. Okay, so let's highlight that as one of the hallmarks of Jansenism. We'll get into why that was and whether or not it's a
Yeah.
bit of a caricature in a section. But go ahead. Okay, so that's the first
Right.
one, moral
So
rigorism.
So I would just comment that rigor, like a lot of the issues that come up in this anthology, these are issues that predate the Jansenist movement and postdate the Jansenist movement. So it's not that they weren't rigorous, it's just that there were many rigorous who were not Jansenists, and that's important I think, for people to understand.
Yeah, I think it's very important for people to understand. I don't want to sidetrack your taxonomy here right from the get go, but one of the reasons why this leaps out at me, and I love what you just said about rigorism, predated and postdated, it's not the be all and end all of Jansenism, is that I've been accused of being somewhat Jansenist in the same way that Dorothy Day was accused of being a Jansenist, insofar as we're accused of being moral rigorists or spiritual purists, or that nobody is a good Catholic unless they're a perfect Catholic or a radical Catholic or out there selling everything. And this was a common complaint against Dorothy Day by
Yeah,
mainstream Catholics, even liberal Catholics, that she was a rigorist.
right.
But not all. And okay, we can debate that till the cows come home. The value,
Sure.
but let's put it up front here. Not all people that are arguing for a more radical version of Catholic living are Jansenists. Okay,
Right,
let's
exactly,
put it.
exactly. And I think that I think Rick and I both, when we make comparisons with traditionalism or we make comparisons with charismatic renewal, people will kind of get excited because they either love or hate traditionalism or they love or hate charismatic renewal. But we're really not trying to score points for a team. I mean, of course, we have our own beliefs. We're both practicing Christians and
Yeah,
opinionated people. There's no doubt about that. But what we're really trying to do is recover a very complex movement or series of movements and understand early modern Catholicism in a more rich, more three-dimensional, more perhaps nuanced, even at times ambiguous way, because that's reality. It's like when we talk about Vatican II, if all you talk about is liberal conservative or something, you're really missing a
that's
lot.
right.
You
And to
know, you're
place
missing.
Jansenism in its historical context, all right, that they were locked in a death throes struggle against the Jesuits of their time. And they were not alone in criticizing the Jesuits of their time for being morally lax.
That's right.
Okay. And,
Yeah.
and so we need to put this in historical context, the charge of moral rigorism, at least in its initial phases with Bishop Jansen and so forth, that maybe, just maybe, there's a context here that helps us to better understand the kind of moral rigorism that they were originally concerned with.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I teach this, I always find ways to slip in either Pascal or something about frequent communion or these sorts of debates. Students actually really, especially seminarians or very involved Catholic students, they really kind of light up, and they actually, I've had students say before, like, this is really reassuring to know that these aren't debates that began in the 1960s. These aren't debates that began in 1870. These are debates that have always been with us. So Therese of Lisieux struggling, or John Vianney, or who are struggling with scrupulosity, struggling with rigorism. This is just the eternal Christian struggle, or the 2,000 years Christian struggle, 3,000 year Judeo-Christian struggle. So when I begin church history courses, I'll sort of set up these kind of two good things that are in tension. You know, so on one hand, you have like universality, and on the other hand, you have purity. Well, those are both good things. Those are both Catholic things. Justice, mercy. You know, the problem is when we don't hold these two things in tension. And there were times, I think, where the Jansenists fell off too far on one side, but there were other times where they were really, like all renewal movements, pointing out very uncomfortable things that were going on that needed to change.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that they really, we can talk about why the movement ended up kind of burning out, and failing in many ways. But a lot of their ideals, a lot of their writings are very beautiful things about all kinds of stuff, with the women reading the Bible, liturgy, etc.
Yeah. And, you mentioned frequency of communion. They advocated, oh gosh, the name escapes me now, but the person who said,
And,
gosh,
and Antoine Arnaud,
Arnaud, talking about, and before Arnaud, oh gosh, oh, why is this
Saint
escape?
Saint Cyran, or
Seurat.
Borromeo.
So yeah, Saint Seurat. Saint Seurat. So, he was advocating that we withdraw from frequent communion, that withdraw from taking communion, in order to create within ourselves a more perfect sense of contrition. That his point seems to have been that frequent reception of communion, absent a deep examination of conscience, followed by a deep repentance, is actually a kind of sacrilege, or at least a laxity. And that,
Right.
so there was a rigorism here, not just in terms of moral rigorism, but a kind of rigorism in sacramental discipline. I don't know if that's point number two that we've moved on to, or is still part of
Yeah, no,
this.
no, that's intimately. I mean, I would say that the very beginning of the movement, or the set of tendencies that are kind of converging in these really spiritually fecund centers around, particularly around France, also somewhat in the Low Countries. And there's all kinds of spiritual renewal going on. Francis de Sales, Jean de Chantal, Cardinal Beyrule, and it's all kind of not. It's not fully
Vincent de
distinguished.
Paul.
Vincent de Paul, absolutely, who fell out with who really lost patience with the Jansenists, because of their finicky doctrinal quibbles that he thought was
Yeah.
missing
Yeah.
missing the point. But I would say, if we had three really important original things, it's a particular, perhaps we call it extreme Augustinian view of divine grace, a moral rigorism. So if you're living at court, in the court of Louis XIV, and there's maybe some
Yeah.
good point here, you're exposed to a level of financial, sexual, political corruption that is probably going to damn you
There
unless
you
you have
go.
some.
Yeah. On
So
page
you're better to
13.
withdraw.
Yeah. On page
So
13, you say, in summary, Jansen stood for a return to strict Augustinian doctrine. Saint Cyran wanted to restore the rigors of ancient discipline in the sacramental and moral life. And Mère Angélique sought a return to the monastic purity of the desert, Saint Benedict and Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. These projects were mutually supportive. So So those are the sort of three prongs, right? There are what
That's right. Yep.
constituted the chance of a radical hyper Augustinian view of grace, or at least their interpretation of it, moral and spiritual sacramental sort of rigorism, and then an emphasis on kind of the monastic ideals, much of which appeals to me other than the Augustinian stuff. But anyway, so let's go back historically then. Let's go back to, in a sense, Jansen himself, from which Jansenism gets it. Who was he, and what was his Augustinianism? What was his main theological point? Because I think this is sort of key.
Yeah, so Cornelius Jansen is a Dutch scripture scholar at Leuven, and he was very well liked by his students. He was a brilliant lecturer on the Psalms, on the Pauline epistles, and he becomes very concerned, as do many Catholics at the time, that there's a post-Tridentine form of Catholicism being advanced by the Jesuits in particular. He's less concerned about Ultramontanism than the later Jansenists are, but particularly a view of divine grace. So he and Saint-Cyran agree that there's essentially what they would call a semi-Pelagianism has been kind of repackaged by the Jesuits because the Jesuits are perhaps in their original form had good intentions. They don't like to criticize Ignatius directly, but very quickly they think the Jesuit order became corrupted by worldliness, corrupted by being too close to power, and the kind of thing we see in Pascal's provincial letters of the sort of alleged, of course, because of course many of these Jesuits were good, holy people, but allegedly there's all kinds of mental gymnastics going on in the confessional, which Pascal just wonderfully satirizes. So basically, there's this original insight that the true doctrine of St. Augustine is very, there's a hilarious line in one of the secondary overviews of Jansenism that like Jansen discovered the pure doctrine of St. Augustine and what the simplicity of the gospel before it was corrupted by deformed or before it was deformed by subsequent commentary. So he wrote a 1,300 page, four-columned book on it.
Yeah, yeah,
So he
yeah.
writes this enormous tome called the Augustinus, and he had corresponded for many years with Saint-Cyran about this. He allegedly read all of Augustine's works 10 times and the works on grace 30 times. And then he writes this massive tome, which CUA Press has brought out a section of this by Guido Stucco, who also contributed a much smaller section for our anthology. And it's essentially an argument that he very carefully exegetes St. Augustine, compares it to the scriptural sources, and then he attacks what he sees as a renewal of semi-Pelagianism, and this is closely tied to that moral critique that you brought up earlier. So they
Yeah.
believe the semi-Pelagian view of grace, or allegedly semi-Pelagian, is the reason why we have this moral laxity, and we have to correct both.
So, I mean, that's tied up with so-called Molinism, the idea that in a way, what Jansen is saying is that according to Molinists and the Jesuits, we sort of meet grace halfway, right? That
Yeah,
grace
right,
comes
right.
to us unmerited, but we have to cooperate with it. And that
That's right.
cooperation is kind of our effort,
That's
even though, Trent would teach and Orthodoxy would teach that even our effort is always already engraced somehow. And then
right.
that brings up the issue of predestination. So, what was Jansen's point of view in terms of grace? Can we resist efficacious grace? Can it be resisted? What is it? And exactly what is then predestination in the eyes of Cornelius Jansen?
Yeah, great. So great question, and it's quite technical and quite tricky, but
Yeah.
I'm gonna speak in broad brushstrokes,
By the
and
way,
as,
before you start the broad strokes, I get frustrated with these kinds of nitpicky arguments too about
yeah,
grace.
yeah. Well,
Very, very, but it's
so
necessary in order to understand what Jansenism was. So,
you
in other words, so go ahead.
you and Vincent de Paul would get along then because he just had
Yeah,
no time. He
yeah,
thought this was it can become almost narcissistic at times when it's too much about your system
yeah,
and let me preface this by saying Yves Congar I think has a brilliant in True and False Reform in the Church. He actually talks in several places about this, and his I really think he's correct here. He says The Jansenists were not wrong in what they affirmed. They were wrong in denying that there was any other possible interpretation. And we'll come back to this later when we talk about a kind of schismatic mindset.
Okay,
But
good, good, good.
basically, Jansen's argument is basically this. Augustine, and he's right historically, Augustine does get to a point late in his life where his anti-Pelagianism is so thorough that he is arguing predestination is without any foreseen merit. Every single stage of the salvation process is unmerited. Now, he does believe, Augustine, Doctor of Grace, he does believe that we cooperate with grace. But the idea was that your desires are changed by grace. So
Yeah,
when Larry and I go down to the bar together, which I hope we can do sometime in Pennsylvania, and
that's
someone
right.
says, do you want this like glass of horse shit or do you want this beautiful, amazing bourbon? Well, anyone who's rightly ordered in any way, we know exactly what you're going to choose.
That's
Martin
right.
Luther, all the people who write about grace have these kinds of moments. That was a very Lutheran way to put it, I suppose. But Saint Augustine, it's the victory of delight. So God saving us or beginning the work of salvation in us is making us repulsed by what is evil
Right.
rather than
By the horse shit. Yeah.
exactly, and delighting in what is good and beautiful, American bourbon or what,
Yeah.
ribs instead of eating rocks or something. So that's his argument is he says absolutely I believe in free will, but our will, it gets back to a view of the fall that the church ultimately says this is too thoroughgoingly negative. This is seeing the fall as too catastrophic of an event. No, actually, we did have there was still a kind of innate goodness in us that wasn't destroyed by the fall. So the Thomists would have said, they had the theory of physical pre-motion, which is very complicated and parsed and parsed and parsed. The Jesuits said God predestines, but let's say God predestines Larry for salvation and me for damnation. The Jesuits said God knew before the foundation of the world what Larry would choose.
Yeah.
That Larry would be offered grace, Shaun would be offered grace, and Shaun freely refuses to cooperate. So it's his own fault that he's damned. Larry cooperates and is saved. The Thomists would say God predestined Larry and not Shaun, but without foreseeing merit. But they have all kinds of philosophical distinctions about why that doesn't obviate free will. I'm not sure I fully understand all of the
I know I
Bunyanist
don't. I know I don't.
and I know I'm sure someone will watch this who can explain it to me, but I've tried and I don't fully understand. Jansen basically said the Molinist view is actually repackaged Pelagianism. It's making humans the authors of their own salvation. This is what the Calvinists, the hardcore Calvinists, would say against the quote unquote Arminians. It's the same basic
Same
argument.
thing. Same basic argument. Yes.
Pretty much. He says the Thomists are not heretics. They're just confused and they have a bunch of uh, medieval scholastic shrapnel that really isn't necessary. And all you really need is the Bible and the early church fathers. And Augustine is sort of the coronation stone on the true, pure tradition. So for Jansen, God predestines before the foundation of the world Larry for salvation and me for damnation. And if you challenge that and say, well, why? That's not fair. He would reply with things like, in the Bible, in the scriptures, it's the childlike who are close to God. It's not the people who are arguing with God and saying the clay saying to the potter, why did you make me this way, etc. So
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
ultimately says it's ultimately mysterious, but he would say everyone deserves to be damned, and God saving the elect is a totally unmerited mystery, which all of these people were fine with consigning huge amounts of people to hell. So we should be honest about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not that the Molinists thought everyone was going to heaven. The Molinists could preach hellfire and brimstone. Absolutely. It's just a question. It's questions of how you understand cooperation, how you understand the fall, things like that.
Yeah. It's just kind of a side topic, but yeah, absolutely lurking in the background, going all the way back to Augustine, perhaps, is this absolute comfort level with believing that it's okay if 90% of the human race ends up damned in hell for all eternity, suffering eternal conscious torment at the hands of
Right.
an angry God, kind of a thing. That this is so. predestination loses its sort of unfairness factor if you
That's right.
factor in from the get-go that you've already adjudicated that sending people in mass quantities into perdition is not in and of itself problematic.
Right.
So
Right. Now
that's
I
just
do now I will say within each of these general traditions, a kind of Jansenist Augustinianism, a Thomist, Banyesianism at this stage, and a Molinist
yeah,
Jesuit, you do have individuals who will like from Balthasar and other, and there are individuals who you can tell are very subtly questioning that. I mean, even Jansen himself says things like, we should pray for the salvation of all. Now, he
yeah,
doesn't think all are going to be saved, but he actually thinks
yeah,
God could save all. And I think that's interesting and important is that, that there are elements of the Jansenist theory or doctrinal superstructure that have been condemned. There's no question about that. But you can get to a universalism easier, I think, actually, with certain views of divine grace, of the overwhelming power of mercy and love, that it radically changes. And I mean, like the sort of theory that you would have as a hopeful universalist, when one stands before God, how do you rationally, or how can you possibly freely reject the ultimate source of goodness, truth, and beauty if you behold it?
yeah.
How could
That's
you
the thing. I
eternally?
mean, it's a fundamental principle of Thomistic anthropology that we cannot
Yes,
choose when confronted with the infinite good, we would without question choose it,
that's right.
because human beings are incapable of choosing evil for the sake of evil. As Aquinas teaches, we always choose evil under the aspects of some kind of good. Even if I'm choosing evil for the sake of evil out of some perverse joy that I get out of it, that joy is in and of itself per se good. And that's what I'm seeking, is the good of that gemütlich feeling that I have when I'm inflicting horror on somebody. All right. And therein lies the problem. But
And there is
nevertheless,
no, I mean, the whole Christian view of evil, like Tolkien is so brilliant about this, about how there's no newness or creativity that's evil, that's
that's right.
only possible for the
That's right.
divinity. So there's tools in the toolbox. My point is that modern
Yeah.
Catholicism is taking tools from lots of different toolboxes on all kinds of doctrinal questions, and the Jansenist Augustinian tradition, and I'm not saying all Augustinians were Jansenists by any stretch, but just to be simple, Jansenist, Augustinian, Thomist, Molinist, it's taking tools from all of those toolboxes in an eclectic way to try to, reform, renew,
Yeah.
represent.
Okay, let's return to the history of this. Okay, so obviously, a lot of these debates are grounded in the church's post-Reformation reaction to Protestantism. Obviously, these are issues that go back to Augustine versus the Pelagians, and on through the various schools of Thomism. But the church had reached a sort of modus vivendi with the various theological schools in this regard, and allowed them all to sort of exist in suspension. Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, all with their peculiar idiosyncratic emphases. Along comes the Reformation, though, and then all of a sudden the shit hits the fan, and shit seems to be the theme of the day here now. But that
Luther would be pleased by this. I don't know if
oh, he would.
Jansen.
I mean, his language was increasingly scatological the older he got, and
Right.
mine is too. But anyway, the fact is, okay, so now implicated in all of this is we have to vindicate the Catholic faith in the light of this Protestant challenge. And one of the central Protestant challenges is precisely their belief that the Catholic Church is Pelagian, that we emphasize
That's right.
works over grace. Now, obviously,
Absolutely.
this is false. It's a caricature, but on a ground level, gut level, there was some sort of phenomenological truth to that descriptor of what Catholics actually believed in terms of salvation. So this is lurking in the background of all of these debates.
Mhm.
So then historically, okay, you get the Jansenists versus the Jesuits, and then various kinds of Thomists enter into the fray. The church does attempt some kind of peace, right? So
Yeah.
talk
Yeah.
about that. The various
Yeah.
popes have tried to say, okay, let's return to a kind of suspended sort of tension here.
That's right. Absolutely. So the popes, whatever negative things can be said about the post-Reformation papacy, and there's plenty of negative things that could be said, they really took seriously their role. There was a great continuity of popes taking very seriously their role as the protector of the peace, the a sort of doctrinal peace, and the protector of a kind of unity and diversity. So we see this emphasized today with all the different rites of the church and ethnicities and all that. But at the time that was beginning very much. I mean, you see this missionary global expansion of Catholicism, but there's a very much a sense that the Pope's job is to pro, proclaim Catholic dogma or good morals or whatever when it's being disputed or denied, but
Right.
not to settle disputes between schools. And that's one reason why something like the Immaculate Conception isn't defined, even though many popes believed in the Immaculate Conception. They would even approve certain liturgical celebrations of it, but they wouldn't define it because it was not settled in the schools.
Well,
So,
or the infallibility of the Pope.
exactly.
They
Exactly.
would talk about it, but they wouldn't define it because there were differing approaches to what in the heck that meant.
Absolutely. That's really pivotal for understanding the development of
And
Jansenism,
we're
especially
going to get to
during.
this later. Yeah. Okay. So go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah. So basically, the reason that you get if Jansen had stopped at saying this is the Augustinian perspective, this is my perspective, and these are all the great reasons to hold this in tradition and scripture, etc., nothing would have ever happened to him. So the reason that Jansenism as such, or the work of Jansen is under scrutiny, is because it's an explicit attack on another school. It's saying if you hold this approved position, because after De Auxiliis, which was the great debate between the Thomistic Dominicans and the Molinist Jesuits, late 1500s, early 1600s, the Pope, I believe it was, oh gosh, Paul V, whose
It
name
was
is
Paul
on
the
St.
Fifth.
Peter's at Borghese. If you go to St. Peter's, you see his
It's
name
right up
carved on.
there.
It's a little self-aggrandizing, but
A little? You think a little?
it was the first time I saw it. I said, "Oh, how beautiful! They're recognizing the Apostle Paul as well as
Borghese.
the other."
Yeah.
And
Anyway.
my Italian said, "No, no, this is an important family." Anyway, so he, to his credit, says, I'm not ruling on this. Dominicans don't call Jesuits heretics. Jesuits don't call Dominicans heretics." And the debate, you promote your own view, but the sniping at one another stops. And this is when the papacy was really at its best. And this continues. And Jansen, unfortunately, Jansen and Saint-Cyran, I guess we have to say in their defense, they did believe that the sort of integrity of the gospel is at stake. So they essentially launched this attack on the Jesuits. The Jesuits can give as good as they get. You know, they're cunning, they were cunning, powerful, well-connected people. So the Sorbonne, which had a very important theological role at the time, the Sorbonne condemns or forwards to Rome a list of theses that are extracted from Jansen's book, allegedly. That's a whole dispute
Yeah.
about whether they're
Fact
actually there.
versus, fit.
Fact, right, yeah, yeah, fait et droit. Yeah, the Pope has the right. So the first thing the Jansenists say when the Pope condemns these five ideas is, okay, we recognize his right to do that, but we dispute the fact they're not actually in there. And this is actually a very common thing when you get condemned or allegedly get condemned. You know, remember the Archbishop of Baltimore, Spalding, when the
Yeah.
Americanist, he says,
Yeah. That's right.
"Fine, but
Yeah. That's right. But that's not me.
there's no such thing." Yeah.
Yeah.
So
That's not me.
modernism is the same thing, and even Nouvelle Theologie, right? De Lubac said, "Okay, Humane Generis, I accept
Yeah.
it,
That's
but
great. But that's not what I said.
I don't believe that." Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Exactly.
and I'm not saying it's disingenuous. It probably is in some cases and not in others. But so the papacy is essentially concerned about Jansenism as something that, I mean, they're under political pressure from the King of France for all kinds of reasons, but as something that could potentially upset a stability in post-Tridentine Catholicism. And as sympathetic as I am to many of the heroic people and ideals of the Jansenists, he was right about that. It could be destabilizing. There's no question about that. Later popes, I did a podcast with Dom Dalmasso about this.
I
He's a
love
great,
Dom Del Masso. Big shout out to the Logos Project
yeah,
and Dom. Good
Great,
buddy.
great guy. Loves Ratzinger. He reads voraciously.
Brilliant guy. Very, very smart
Very,
guy.
very sharp. I think I'm getting too old to read that much because I can't sort of focus, but he's
Yeah.
just blitzing through stuff. But anyway, there's many attempts that are not as well known by later popes to say, look, whatever we've said against Jansenism, we're not condemning the true thought, if you will, of St. Augustine. We're not condemning Aquinas. We're not saying, as some, unfortunately, some Jesuits were saying, that now Molinism is the official position. You have to be a Molinist. So into the 18th century, popes like Clement XII, Benedict XIV, who I think is the best pope of early modernity, he's pope in the middle of the 1700s. He's very, very clear. The Augustinian school is valid, the Thomistic school is valid, the Molinist school is valid. So that's a good thing that we should celebrate for all the bad,
Valid as in perfectly orthodox in terms of
perfectly
how
orthodox.
you can construe all of this in an orthodox direction.
That's right. That's right. Right. And that's when the papacy is at its best. It's a servant of the servants of God who is facilitating diversity, creativity, flourishing in unity. And there were times where I think that the popes really handled this dispute well, and there were
Yeah.
unfortunately some times where I think the papacy overstepped and poured gasoline on the fire
Yeah,
rather
we'll come
than
to that in a second. But I would just say this, with just in general as a theologian. I mentioned earlier, I get frustrated with these debates. Obviously, I'm a Lubacian when it comes to the relationship between nature and grace and his debate with Lagrange and the Thomists and so on. However, I would say this that it's possible for Aquinas to have been wrong on something. So the endless debates about what Aquinas did or did not say don't move me at all anymore. At the
that's
very
right. Yeah.
at the very least, we could say, well, he was ambiguous because he was not asking the same questions about nature and grace that we are now asking. And so he doesn't answer them quite to our satisfaction. And thus, you get these varying interpretations of Aquinas. Be that as it may, you're dealing with a divine mystery here. You're dealing with the very essence of the incarnation, of the interfacing between God and world, nature and grace, the natural and the supernatural, and you're therefore dealing with something which is unresolvable in some sort of airtight rationalistic manner. And it seems to me that so many of these debates are, yes, they're concerned with orthodoxy. They are. I'm not going to say they're not. But you do reach a point of frustration where you throw up your hands in exasperation and say, can't we just say that grace informs nature in a way that makes nature more itself somehow? And let's move on from that.
There was a group of loosely defined network or movement called that a French historian called the Third Party, who this was really their position. One in particular, I think his name was Fortunato of Brescia in the north of Italy, and he said, "Can't we just say, if you're damned, it's your own fault. If you're saved, it's through God's grace. Can we just leave it at that?" Because he was
Oh
so
yeah,
sick of
the
these
prayer.
debates get exported all around the Catholic world, and they cause all kinds of upheavals. Even in Italy, you have this
The
debate
great
event.
prayer, yeah, the great prayer of Joan of Arc, which was, I pray if I be in a state of grace that God keep me so. I pray if I be not in a state of grace that God make me so. That there are elements in there, perhaps, of an Augustinian view of grace. I
Yeah,
don't know. But the fact is, yeah, we're dealing with the mystery of salvation. And that's why I wanted to bring it back historically. What
yeah,
historically was going on that really put fire in these equations, that made these people so strong in their belief that the resolution of these theological questions had absolutely earth-shaking consequences that we simply had to resolve. That's
yeah.
what's interesting to me. So the history in your introduction here is fascinating. And so now I want to get to the politics in a sense. What role in all of this does Gallicanism play? Does the role of the French king play? The French king, Louis, he comes in, and he puts pressure on the Pope to condemn the Jansenists and so on. So unpack some of this sort of
Yeah.
history as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really fascinating story, and it's full of like kinds of irony, really. So the Gallican deriving from Gaul, the ancient kingdom of France. Um, Let me fast forward and then come back. So by the time of the French Revolution, you have a paradoxical situation where you have a Gallican church, an officially Gallican church, so an anti-ultramontane church but headed by a king who is quite pro-papal and did not want the Jesuits to be dissolved. So you
Yeah.
have this very, or his father at least, that would have been Louis the 15th when the Jesuits were dissolved. But so you have this paradoxical situation unveiled. So the way that this all happens is, so you have Louis the 14th, who's so-called absolutist king, the Sun King, builds
Yeah.
Versailles, and he really wants, he's deeply anti-Protestant. He wants one king, one one faith, one France. Consolidating power from the nobility, anti-Protestant, and he sees this group of idealistic reformers. Cardinal Richelieu, for example, came after Saint-Cyran and put him in jail towards the end of his life because he thought he was sort of infecting these young men with these radical religious ideals when they should be fighting wars. And
The
uh,
solitaires.
exactly, exactly. So he didn't want talented young men going to Port Royal or becoming these sort of Catholic worker types, frankly, is what many
That's
of them
right. That's
were.
what they were. Yeah.
He wanted them going into work for the CIA and do all these horrible, unsavory things. So there is a kind of purity of the Jansenist movement against the kind of worldliness. And that's why so many French people were sympathetic to them. Anyway, Louis the 14th decides that he's going to eradicate Jansenism because he's just sick of how every time he thinks they're down and out, they come back. So he literally destroys the convent of Port Royal and handles the nuns with great rigor. He sends them to all these different convents. They're essentially prisoners. He puts a lot of the men in the Bastille in the prison. And then he convinces the Pope to issue a definitive, what is meant to be a definitive condemnation of Jansenism. So rather than condemning an idea that's allegedly taken from a book, a papal committee takes 101 verbatim sentences from the next generation. The leader of the next generation of Jansenism has a biblical
Yeah.
commentary. His name is Pasquier Canel. And we have a passage, his commentary on John chapter 15 is included in the volume, translated by my friend John Meinert, who's a professor at Benedictine in Kansas.
It's a great document, though. I read it last night. It's very
Right.
good.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful reflections.
Yeah.
So this committee in Rome draws up a bull that the Pope approves of and contributes to himself, called Unigenitus, meaning only begotten, the first word of the bull, the only begotten Son of God. It's 101 condemnations of things that are verbatim taken from Canel. So you can't get around it by saying fact and right or intention of author. I mean, you can a little bit with intention of author, and there were people who did that. But the French church basically they split on this question. Certainly, a minority are against the bull, but it's a powerful minority. And we include a really important document in that, which is called the appeal. So they four bishops. So this is issued in 1713. People are writing to Rome, kind of like what Cardinal Burke and some of the others were doing with Francis, with these
Yeah.
dubia. So
The
this is
dubia.
another thing where my students will go, "Oh my gosh, I thought this had never happened before. This is totally unprecedented. We've
Yeah.
never had bishops disagreeing with the Pope."
Yeah.
So these
And
bishops are
we've had popes ignore dubia before too.
exactly right. I know. I remember hearing that. This is why Rick and I connected initially, was because we were delving so deeply into Jansenism. We're seeing all these fascinating parallels of every time, just like in politics, if someone says unprecedented, if you're talking about the church or you're talking about the state, it's probably
Yeah,
not
it's
unprecedented.
unprecedented that Pope Francis would not answer these dubia.
Yeah,
Well, actually, there's a lot of
exactly.
press. There's a lot of
So,
precedent. You
So
know.
Pope Clement refuses to answer, refuses to clarify the bull. He says the bull says what it says, accept it or don't accept it. And they say, well, that isn't how it works in France. In France, we receive papal teaching. And this is ultimately condemned at the First Vatican Council. So
Mm-hmm.
four bishops enter the Sorbonne very dramatically in March of 1717, and they have an appeal drafted. That the four of them sign it, and they're appealing the bull Unigenitus to a hypothetical future ecumenical council. And it isn't just four bishops, it's also 97 of the 110 doctors of theology at the Sorbonne signed the appeal. Now, many of them are not Jansenists, but that what they see this as an abuse of papal power. They
An
see it as the
overreach.
exactly. The
And
Pope
actually,
coming.
too, a violation of previous papal precedent of simply keeping the peace.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. So there's a tension between the absolutist crown, Louis XIV, although I think he's dead at this point. But the Bourbon crown, which is increasingly grasping at absolutism. So there's all these other mechanisms that were put in place in medieval France that the king is trying to sort of steamroll all of these and be, le tête c'est moi, I am the state, right?
Yeah.
So they're against that, and so there are people who are dragged into the orbit of this debate that was originally about different things that we were talking about with Jansen and Sanceron and Mother Angelique Arnaud, and it now becomes about the proper relationship between king and parliament, which is a huge issue in England as well. So you have sympathy of Jansenist sympathizers in the Anglican Church who think that they have interesting political and theological ideals. So it's about church and state, and it's also about what is the proper relationship between the Pope and a national church, or between the Pope and a collection of bishops. And there's this great line in the appeal where they basically say, Holy Father, with respect, it looks like you just think we're people who execute your decisions. You don't really think that we're judges of the faith, but we're successors of the apostles and we're judges of the faith. So this is a debate that really doesn't get resolved with any finality until Vatican I to some extent. And as we know very well, and I'm sure your listeners know, this is not resolved by Vatican I. Vatican II, this is in some ways the central gridlock, episcopal collegiality versus a more kind of
Yeah.
monarchical view. Oh, but we're
Well,
still dealing with it now, right? We're still
I mean,
dealing with it.
well, there was so much gridlock that at the end of the dogmatic constitution of the church, Lumen Gentium, after so much debate about the relationship between papal authority and episcopal authority, that they had to append at the end of the so-called Nota Previa, which was
Yeah,
a short statement from Paul VI saying, "Despite everything that was just said, I'm still in charge." So,
that's right. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so with
Ratzinger.
cum
Yeah,
petro et sub petro, let's emphasize the sub petro, shall we?
that's right. That's right. Yeah, Ratzinger, young Ratzinger was quite feisty about this actually. About he said something like, "Whatever one thinks of the Nota Previa, it didn't strengthen the document Lumen Gentium, or it hardly strengthened the affirmation of collegiality." And Congar actually says in his diary that he heard a rumor, which I presume is very credible. He heard a rumor that members of the minority who were fearful that collegiality would lead to a kind of democratization or Protestantization of the church, they went to Paul VI. We know for sure that this happened. But what
Yeah.
Congar heard was that they brought up the specter of the Synod of Pistoia, which was a very late Jansenist kind of restatement and
Yes.
even kind of more bitter and more sectarian statement of these kind of Gallican
Well, I
ideals.
think this is confirmed by Louis Bouillet's memoirs as well, where he mentions
Okay,
that the minority did go to Paul VI and press their case that this to tie it back to our conversation, that the emphasis on collegiality at Lumen Gentium was going to open up once again the specter of Gallicanism, the
right.
specter
Okay.
of a
Yeah.
kind of Protestantized of the church. So for the sake of our viewers, the deal is this: Vatican II did, in a sense, go against what had become more recent to them papal teaching, like Pius XII.
Yeah. Right.
That in a sense, the three main functions of the bishops, in Latin, the munera, the three main functions of governing, teaching, and sanctifying, came to the bishop simply by papal delegation. That the
Right.
Pope only had those things in their fullness by divine right, which he then parsed out to the bishops. So the bishops became branch managers of Catholic CEO, Catholic Inc., with the Pope as CEO. And what Vatican II says no is the three munera, the three functions, sanctifying, teaching, government, come to a bishop by divine right in light of their consecration. And thus, Vatican II affirmed the authority of the Apostolic College. Now, the vis-a-vis the Pope. Now, the only question then remaining is, okay, what happens when there's tension between the Apostolic College and its authority and that of the Pope? Well, then obviously the Pope is the court of final appeal, and the Pope resolves those tensions. Fine, everybody went home happy. The Nota Previa is appended at the end. But you're absolutely right, Shaun. The question of Gallicanism and the role of conciliarism versus papal infallibility. These are still issues in the church that are they're like a hanging chad. Speaking of elections, right? Like a hanging chad, that have
Yeah,
never quite
absolutely.
been resolved. So let's then step back. So this is why this debate about what goes on with the Jansenists in like the 18th century and then into the 19th century Vatican. This is why this is so still relevant to us today. So what was then what happened? What unfolded historically in this great
Yeah,
debate between
yeah,
the
yeah.
French and the Pope over this Jansenist controversy?
Sure. Let me read a very brief quote from the appeal, which is saying exactly this debate that rolls into Vatican II that you were just discussing. So the bishops say, and remember, many people sign on to this. Something between 3 and 5% of all the clergy in France sign this, and we can imagine that the sympathy is much higher. The same way that very few people who have issues with Pope Francis might sign publicly something, but they might privately
Yeah,
have the issue. So we
yeah,
can, I would say that it's a very substantial minority of the French church that is troubled by Unigenitus. So they say, quote, the Unigenitus seem to leave to the bishops only the ministry of executing the Pope's decrees, even though they received immediately from Jesus Christ the power to judge matters concerning faith, morals, and discipline. So this is the whole question. They're saying we are successors of the apostles. We
yeah.
don't judge unigenitus because you give us permission to. That's our job as bishops. So this is, and I'm not saying who was right or wrong in the case of the appeal as such, but it's a deeply relevant, neuralgic, central issues that are being tackled. After unigenitus, you have some of these efforts by the papacy that I referenced earlier to really try to mitigate this situation because there's a kind of discontent that's spreading. There's many, of course, all these things are complicated. They have many different factors. The suppression of the Jesuits, which is sort of finalized by the papacy in 1773, the process is beginning in the 1760s. That is a kind of belated Jansenist vengeance for Unigenitus, and they were very explicit about this. If you think the gloating going on today on social media is bad, you should see what Jansenists were saying. So if you ever feel bad for Jansenists, oh, the poor nuns and the poor men in the Bastille, they gave as good as they got at least, as did the Jesuits. So the Jesuit order being suppressed, there's multiple causes for that. That's a globally significant event. But a huge thorn in the side of the Jesuits was the continued pro-Jansenist, anti-Jesuit position. And we even have in the anthology, we have translations of songs that were sung on the streets of Paris by people hating on the Jesuits that are sort of these pro Jansenist tunes. So you maybe have two guys drinking a
Have you
bottle of wine.
translated any of those in the book? Because they could become
Oh yeah,
popular.
yeah.
They could become popular again.
I don't want to. I went to Marquette, so I can't bite the hand that feeds
I
me
went
too
to
much.
Fordham. I went to Fordham,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and we have a
I
Jesuit Pope. I don't know. I just think
That's right.
I'm just joking, obviously, but
Uh, no,
there
no.
is
The Jesuits are the same. They're the same. They're the best. The best and the worst. I mean, they're incredibly ambitious, unique, creative, and they can be the greatest, or they can be
what's the old
they can
Latin
be the
phrase?
best.
Corruptio
Yeah.
optima pessima.
Exactly right. So, I mean, of course, I have deep love for the Jesuits. I learned much of this under the tutelage of Ulrich Lehner, who's a German church historian, but
Yeah.
also Father Joe Mueller, a Jesuit.
And
Anyway, but
my
these
my
people.
dissertation director was the late great Father Edward Oakes, S.J. So
Oh,
yeah,
really?
yeah.
I didn't
Oh
know
yeah.
that.
Oh yeah. And he aided me greatly
Fantastic.
in my translations of Balthazar from German.
He's
Whenever
amazing.
whenever I
Oakes,
got stuck on a term, he helped me
yeah,
out big time.
Oakes is fantastic. Jared Wicks, Gerald O'Collins, who just passed away. Anyway, we could
And
go
my
on and on.
former colleague Rodney Hauser, he did his dissertation on Balthazar under Raymond Goronsky at
Oh,
Marquette,
wow.
former
Right, right.
deceased
Yeah,
Jesuit. Anyway,
yeah,
anyway, go
yeah.
ahead.
So basically, my point is that this debate keeps spiraling and spiraling and spiraling. So you might be a member of the Parliament of Paris, and you might have profoundly pro-Jansenist sympathies, but for sort of political and cultural reasons. you're a middle class Parisian, you don't like political absolutism, you have Jansenists in your family, maybe you aren't even a devout Catholic as such, but it becomes a sort of culture war, like we see in America, where people can be sort of coded blue or coded red. There's a similar kind of cultural rift between a sort of Baroque,
Yeah.
Tridentine, Ultramontane Jesuit Catholicism and a kind of maybe more middle class, more open to reading the Bible.
Can I
Yeah,
stop you there? This is so key. I mean, right up into the 20th century, we tend to forget how influential the interface between politics and theology is. And so, for example, even the debate between de Lubac and Lagrange. Lagrange was part of Action Française, and why
right,
he was a little sympathetic to the Vichy government, although he was not in any way a Nazi sympathizer. Still,
right, right.
he wanted to restore the monarchy. He wanted to
Yeah,
restore the ancien regime in some sense, right? At least the integralist parts of it.
absolutely.
Whereas de
Yeah,
Lubac was part of Catholic Action. He believed in sort of subversive cultural change from below. The whole sort of a more Dorothy Day kind of approach to
yeah.
things. All right, and so
What you're more sympathetic to.
yeah, and so he was not an advocate of the Vichy or the Ancien Regime or any of that kind of stuff. And so that I'm not saying that determined the theology, but darn it, it's in the
Yeah, yeah.
background.
Oh, it's huge.
And
It's
it's
huge.
same here when we're talking about the French disputes of this period. We cannot ignore the attitude of the French towards their king, towards the Pope, towards the Jesuits, towards the gents. I mean, towards the bourgeois, towards the peasants. All of this stuff factors in.
Absolutely. So there's a great historian who sadly passed away about 2 years ago named Dale Van Clay. He's emeritus at Ohio State, and his great work is called The Religious Origins of the French Revolution. It published, I think, in the 80s, and then he wrote many books along a similar theme. And he has a great line in it where he says, Jansenism did not cause the French Revolution, but it conditioned many of the divisions in French society that made it possible. So there is a profound link between Jansenism and the revolution, not in the kind of conspiratorial way that later Ultramontane said, "Oh, it's Jews and Freemasons and Jansenists, and they all got together because they hate the church." There's nothing like that. But there were the Estates General or the parliaments of Paris were fragmented in ways that allowed for this kind of cataclysmic cultural split. And this is a kind of religious ideological ingredient. It's not the only ingredient, but it's an important one. So anyway,
Well, but to point out, I mean, David Bentley Hart, for example, makes the point that if the French as a whole, as a block of people, were so on board with the monarchy and the ancien regime, then
yeah,
why did the French Revolution happen at all? Why
yeah.
the great bloodbath after? Why the great transformation of French society if they were so satisfied with what was there? Jansenism fed into that dissatisfaction.
Yes,
I
yes,
think that's your
absolutely.
point.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. So after the suppression of the Jesuits, you have this kind of that's in 1773, Pope Clement XIV. Uh, the Jesuit order is dissolved. It survives in little pockets. It survives under Orthodox Catherine of Russia and Protestant Frederick in Prussia. Um, Jansenism is sort of now riding the coattails of resurgent what we might call enlightened absolutists. So there's another paradox here. They're parliamentarians and maybe even proto-republicans in France, but in Joseph II's Austria, they're tightly connected to the centers of power. They want top-down reform. They want the monastic orders who are, they believe, peddling indulgences and scapulars and superstitions. They want them sidelined. The monastic life is the Benedictine life. It's the ancient form of monastic life. It's not uh, the Franciscans of the spear that pierced Jesus. So they get really anti-monastic. They start attacking popular piety. They have some very positive things, though. They're encouraging vernacular Bible reading. They're encouraging the toleration of Jews and Protestants. And this is happening in Tuscany, in Naples, in the Holy Roman Empire. And then the sort of culmination point of this is the Synod of Pistoia in 1786.
Okay, great.
Uh,
Let's get to that.
Sure, sure. So Joseph II is the Holy Roman Emperor. His based in Vienna. His mother is the great Maria Theresia. Little sister is Marie Antoinette, who of course is of immortal memory. Um, his younger brother, Peter Leopold, rules Tuscany. So Italy at the time, is a patchwork of different states. And he chooses as a basically a kind of ecclesiastical lieutenant a very, very, very fiery Jansenist named Scipione de' Ricci, who comes from one of these old aristocratic families of Florence. So there's a movement within Italy of political and religious radicals who are receiving Jansenist ideals and texts from France and also from Utrecht. Utrecht had become a kind of hotbed of basically refugees who had been kicked out
Yeah.
of France or elsewhere, and they're tolerated in Protestant Holland because the Dutch don't care uh, if you're Catholic, you're Catholic. They just say that sort out your differences. We don't care. Just don't
Yeah.
build your church too high. And so anyway, Scipione de' Ricci is sitting at the feet of this network that historians call Roman Jansenism. There's several cardinals, theologians who are deeply anti-Jesuit and increasingly open to more and more kind of just openly Jansenist texts and sources. He's named Bishop of Pistoia and Prato, which is a combined diocese right outside Florence. He's given enormous latitude by Peter Leopold, who, and remember at this time in history, sovereigns and princes really
Yeah.
could, if they wanted to, if they had the political muscle, they could really block Roman intervention. So the Pope could say, no, don't do this, or I'm calling you to Rome to
It's an
answer
era
cases.
of Italian. There is no Italy. There's just city states still,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
the role of the
exactly.
nobility is just huge.
Exactly. So monarchs would even ban certain papal publications. There was this process called the exequatur, where a papal encyclical or bull would come into the territory and it would be examined by canonists, by theologians, and the monarch could just say nope, and they could effectively block it. So
Yeah.
Peter Leopold was doing this. He expels the Inquisition from Tuscany, which was a sort of symbolically powerful. He did all kinds of fascinating things. He ended the death penalty in Tuscany. He was drafting a constitution for Tuscany. So he was a real kind of Enlightenment Catholic ruler, for better or worse in different phases of life. So he essentially sponsors and allows Ricci to have a kind of highly symbolic diocesan synod in Pistoia. So it's about 250 clergy. They're all Italians, but they get sort of the pro-Jansenist theologians, the
And you
top
have a
of the.
book on this, by the way. You have a
That's
book
right.
on.
That's right. Yeah. So my first book is called The Synod of Pistoia and Vatican II because there's a lot of interesting
Let's get a
parallels. And
plug in there for that because I have it. I've read it. It's a great book.
thank you.
Anyway, go ahead. I interrupted.
Thank you. Glad you think so. So it's this is really kind of a dress rehearsal for something that they want the other Tuscan dioceses to imitate, and then they're going to cap this off with a national council of all the Tuscan bishops, all the Tuscan clergy, and then they want the other churches around the Catholic world to imitate this. So the idea is that there's this sort of tidal wave of synodal reform of the church. So this is why this has been brought up recently by Vigano and
Yeah.
Schneider and people who are very disturbed by synodality. So actually, Archbishop Schneider went on the Fox, sorry, the Freudian slip, the EWTN, the paper
Well,
Fox.
Raymond Arroyo is on Fox too,
Yeah.
so it's an
And
understandable.
he Schneider said, that we have a precedent for this. It's a Synod of Pistoia, and I have an article in America Magazine about this. But anyway, the Synod of Pistoia is known in history as the kind of high point of this Jansenist enlightened absolutist alliance. It's also known for kind of remarkably foreshadowing Vatican II on liturgy. So there's a whole range of reforms that are called for. They technically stop short of implementing a vernacular mass, but they basically say for all these pastoral reasons, we should have mass in Italian, and they'd begun to do it. Now, the Synod of Pistoia, it also reasserts all kinds of Jansenist ideas about ecclesiology, about divine grace, about indulgences, all kinds of stuff. But it is utterly rejected by the people of Tuscany. So there's some support from the clergy. There's good recent research that many of the clergy were much more open to this than previously thought, but the laity were absolutely furious.
Why
Most of
is
them,
that? Why is that?
So there's a number of reasons. I think Ricci himself was, I'm sympathetic to elements of his personality and his agenda, but he was very arrogant. I think he had a very bad temper, and I think he looked down on people. I think people who opposed him, he just thought were ignorant or beholden to superstition and sin and things like that. So he made a number of personal blunders. The ground had not been tilled at all. This is a process that would have taken at least decades. He also very foolishly attacked certain key popular devotions. So this is perhaps another parallel with the implementation of Vatican II in some places. So
That's
you
why
talk
that's why I'm raising this, because
you talk about silly season. So I
yeah.
know it depends on where you lived, right? It depends on where you lived and
Oh,
what your
I mean,
experience.
it was
But
absolutely true. The suppression of Marian devotions, of
right.
Eucharistic devotions, of various saints, and so on. This was real. This happened.
Totally, totally, totally. And that happened in Tuscany in those days. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's interesting. You have traditionalists will look at the Synod of Pistoia to try to sort of undermine Vatican II, to say, oh, look at how bad Vatican II is because we see these parallels here in this condemned synod. But they'll also look at it, and non-traditionalists too, as a matter of historical interest, and say, when you radically change people's popular devotions, or you tell people that the way their parents prayed was wrong, you do risk, at the very least, risk enormous discontent. So he just did stupid things. He banned, there was this confraternity tradition around funerals, and he banned it, and he tried to get everyone to go into the same confraternity called the Confraternity of Charity. Everything had to be useful as well. This was a typical blunder of the well-meaning Enlightenment reformer. So the idea was that the confraternity had to be about um, personal conversion, of course, but also actual charity to the poor, which is beautiful and great. But confraternities were also about drinking lots of wine together and women knitting banners and men taking up visiting people in the country and having the festival for the local saint. And he just ran roughshod over all of that. And the last straw was there was a rumor which it's ambiguous in his. I went to Florence and read thousands of his letters. I had an amazing time in the Florence archive. It's actually ambiguous to me about whether he intended to do this when he was accused of it, but there's no question he did intend this. There was a special relic in the Prato Cathedral, which was allegedly the belt of the Virgin Mary. So, not to offend the pious among us, but there are several of these belts around. But this is the one that the citizens of Prato were certain was the real belt of the Virgin Mary. It's in a beautiful, beautiful side altar in the Prato Cathedral. And then there's an image of Mary in Pistoia called the Madonna del Umiltà, the Our Lady of Humility. And the rumor was he was going to remove that and he was going to remove the belt to
Yeah.
say they were false devotions, false relics. And the people literally rioted. So they broke into his cellar, they drank all of his wine, they ripped his episcopal chair out of the cathedral and burned it in the square. And the Grand Duke had to send the army into Pistoia to calm the crowd down. And at that point, the Grand Duke knew this: if this is happening, it's not happening anytime soon. And he sort of calmed the reforms down.
Okay, so my reason for asking that, because to bring this back to the Jansenist thing, what is the relationship then? But we see that the Council of Pistoia failed theologically because it gets condemned, then also fails on a popular level for all the reasons you just stated. But in one sense, was it a Jansenist big council this because
Yeah,
it embraced an Augustinian approach to grace, and that perhaps these Enlightenment based attempts at reform was the translation of Jansenist rigorism into this Enlightenment modality, perhaps?
yeah, it's a late Jansenism. So there's people who the further you go from the original kind of tendencies, as Rick beautifully puts, it becomes a tradition of thought. So it
Yeah.
becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and it can sort of bring more and more people into its orbit.
Okay, so this
That,
is we're sort of running out of time, but maybe well, of course we can go as long as we want. But I just uh, to me, then I'm reminded of of the words of Indigo Montoya in Princess Bride. You keep on using that word, but I do not think it means what you think it does. You know, and so
yeah,
not you, but people throw the word Jansenism around, And
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't think it means what they, and so this has been a wonderful conversation to get at that. And that's why I'm curious about the relation between Jansenism and the Council of Pistoia. But then how,
right.
what it becomes a tradition. How does that tradition, to sort of fast forward here, how does it show up in, and I would say in negative and distorting ways then in the Irish church, in the American church?
Yeah, yeah,
What
yeah.
does it morph into beyond its historical origins and everything we've been talking about? Does it morph into something else? And if it does, what is that?
Yeah. So Rick and I both argue, and we think we're really in that this would be this the mainstream historical perspective. As a movement, it dies around 1830, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. But in very briefly, it's post French Revolution, the high water mark of it as a movement really spanning from Peru to Lebanon. There were Melkite Catholics that were sympathetic to some of these ideas. They weren't
Yeah.
thoroughgoing, but anti-Roman, anti-Ultramontane, for example. So the height of it is the eve of the French Revolution. The French Revolution is this stunning, dramatic comeback for the papacy, where the papacy's on its last legs. There's gloating free thinkers who are saying this is the end of the papacy. There won't even be another pope after Pius VI. Well, not only is there another pope, he signs the concordant with Napoleon, and Catholicism really recovers dramatically in the 19th century. So Jansenism is on its last legs. It's really petering out 1830s, 1840s. It remains in France as a very important cultural touchstone, literary tradition. There are intellectuals who are, of course, transfixed with Pascal, with the women of Port Royal. There's all kinds of nationalist, maybe even proto-feminist reasons why people are interested in it. But it's not a vital ecclesial movement. Regarding America and the Irish, I find this fascinating because when I first started hearing about Jansenism, it was a story that I'm sure you heard as well, which is, oh, Father so and so is very severe. You have to realize the Irish nuns educated him, and they're Jansenists because, and maybe it
Yeah.
stops there. They're Jansenists, or maybe they explain more. And if they explain more, they usually say something like, we know in Ireland it was illegal. There were no seminaries under British rule, so we had to get priests the priests had to train in France or in Leuven, and they were infected with Jansenism, and they came to Ireland. Well, there's really almost, as far as I can tell, and I've followed the evidence and looked and looked and looked, there's really no historical evidence for this. Um,
Interesting.
it, it's a confusion. Now there is an Irish Jansenism. There's a great book called Irish Jansenism by Thomas O'Connor, who's a historian at Maynooth University, which is allegedly the center of Irish Jansenism. But he's Irish diocesan priest. So there was an Irish Jansenist network in the early stages, and they were people who were based in Paris and based in Leuven. That after Unigenitus, the more, so 1713, the more missionary based churches were the least likely to resist Unigenitus because they're under direct control by propaganda fide. So to be a vicar apostolic or to be an Irish bishop, you are signing on to the anti-Jansenist documents. You're dependent on Rome in a way that French bishops are not only not dependent on Rome, they're not allowed to be dependent on Rome in that same sense, or German bishops or Spanish bishops. So there's a thoroughgoing perhaps not ultramontane, but loyalism, papal loyalism on this question. The Irish bishops unanimously accept the condemnation of the Synod of Pistoia. There's one significant Irishman, so we're fast forwarding now to the end of the 1700s, named John Lanigan, who is a friend of some of the Pistoians. He's invited to attend the Synod. He refuses to attend because he's more prudent than, he's sympathetic
Yeah.
on some level.
Right. Right.
He goes back to Ireland. His friends, he's a brilliant historian, but he's known to be doctrinally suspect. His friends try to get him a job at Maynooth, and they tell him, you're more than qualified. We'd love to have you. You have to sign the condemnation of the Synod of Pistoia. He refuses to sign it. He doesn't get a job. So Maynooth was actively screening against uh, doctrinal Jansenism. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't rigorists. That doesn't mean they didn't have damaging sexual neurosis. That doesn't mean they didn't emphasize fire and brimstone in hell. I mean, all of these things are part of the wider universe of Jansenism, but not coterminous with it. There was certainly a Gallican, there was a Gallican tinged component of the first generation of Maynooth professors. Many of them were French or French educated. And there was a Gallican lean. They weren't radical Gallicans. And there was a rigorism. There's no question about that. So I think in the 19th century, you get this sort of, or when people look back on it, you have this confusing cocktail of things where you have this sort of early Gallican influence. It becomes very ultramontane under Cardinal Paul Colin in the 1850s. He's one of the champions of the definition of papal infallibility. He's deeply anti-Jansenist. He says that he wants to import Roman maxims into Ireland. He was the rector of the Irish College and, totally thoroughly anti-Jansenist. So was there some early influence in Ireland? Yes, there was everywhere. Um, did the Irish bishops have control of the situation in the 18th century? All the evidence I've seen says that they did. Were the Irish exporting Jansenism in any kind of recognizable doctrinal sense? Absolutely not. So if you argue that there's some sort of influence, you have to get into, I think, a too vague understanding of some sort of vibe. I think it's just rigorism. It's just there's rigorous.
This is interesting to me because I think you're absolutely right. This is why this is an important point to me, that we have to distinguish. We throw these terms around like Jansenism in an ahistorical way, and we use them synonymously with simply an antibody sort of form of
Yeah,
moral rigorism with a fixation on sexual issues. But that's not Jansenism as such,
yeah,
in its essence. And so, for the sake of actually adjudicating these questions properly, in putting them in a proper intellectual theological genealogy in the history of the church, it is very important to understand that this debate about a more rigorous moral theology rooted in a more monastic and radical understanding of the faith, living out the evangelical counsels, living the Sermon on the Mount, is a much broader debate within the church that's been
yes,
going on.
yes,
It's been going on since the debate between Peter and
yes,
Paul over the Judaizers, right?
yeah,
Which was
absolutely.
really, in many ways, a debate about rigorism, and
Yeah,
legalism
yeah,
versus a more expansive understanding of things. So, yeah, I think it's really important to nuance this properly. But before we leave, I want to focus in again on Gallicanism. I know it's become very fashionable of late to be anti-ultramontane, and I'm anti-ultramontane, just for the record as well. But a lot depends on what you mean by ultramontanism. It simply means across the mountains. In some sense, it's a good thing. In this regard, Gallicanism, it seems to me historically, you're the historian, you can correct me, but it sort of reaches its high point when there is still a broad consensus in whatever nation we're talking about the Catholic faith, and there's a kind of confessional state involved, the kind of
definitely. Yeah,
integralism. All right. But after the French Revolution and the rise of secular forms of government in Western society, that kind of Gallican ecclesiology goes away. At exactly the same time, then papal infallibility gets defined. The Pope loses the papal states. All of a sudden, the papacy actually paradoxically rises in power as it loses power in terms of concordats with various nation states, loses the papal states. All of a sudden now it becomes far more important in the life of the church as the fulcrum upon which the entire universal church is balanced. So I would argue we need to be very careful in our terms here. We need to be very careful in saying, well, we just need a synodal church now. We just need to return to giving doctrinal authority to Episcopal conference and so on. We need to diminish the authority of the Pope. Okay, these are all debates clearly we need to have. But let's not become Anglicans, is my point. There's a control in this experiment, and I don't think it's an altogether illegitimate fear to fear the Anglicanization of the Catholic Church in the modern world, and that we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater if we become overly critical of papal authority. I'm soapboxing here just a bit, but I really am interested in your opinion, Shaun, on what I've just said and on these, because the listeners are going to say, okay, What's the cash value of all of this for our current debates
Yeah,
over
yeah,
papal authority, synodality? I'm really interested in your views on this.
yeah. Oh man, it's very, very difficult because I like everyone, I'm living in history. And there are moments
Yeah.
where, if you ask me this at different moments of the last
Mhm.
5 years, I might say different things. There are some important principles. Let me speak historically for one more moment, which is that you're absolutely right about Gallicanism, uh, and really conciliarism, the wider theory of conciliarism, the supremacy of the ecumenical council, at least in emergency circumstances over the Pope, needed the confessional state. There's no doubt about it. So the irony of this is that the kind of quote unquote more liberal or more modernizing, more enlightened Catholics are of this persuasion. But when the world dramatically and quickly changes, it's actually the ultramontanes, the so-called intransigents, who are more suited, more well fitted to face the modern world. So there's a great paradox or perhaps irony there. Glauco
Interesting.
Scattini is a brilliant young historian who finished his doctorate at Fordham a couple years ago. He translated the last translation here of Henri Gregoire, the great French Republican who loved Port Royal, revolutionary and Republican. And this is really his argument. He's writing a book called, well, it's coming out soon with OUP, called The Invention of Catholicism. And what he means by that is, as a discernible ideology in the 19th century in competition with other ideologies, which is not what it was in the 18th century or 17th century. Maybe
Right.
vis-a-vis Protestantism, but not vis-a-vis socialism, nationalism. No, nothing like that. So, that's historically, I think you're absolutely right. This is the great paradox: is the papacy's on its last legs. Ultramontanism looks defeated. It looks intellectually in a dead end, and then it massively surges. And a big part of that was the missions, by the way, the missions and the connection with the
Oh, yeah, good
people,
point. Yeah.
all kinds of stuff like that. I mean, I'm out here in Australia, and I mean that Australia was under propaganda. I mean, it was directly
Yeah.
dependent Ireland and Rome, frankly. Anyway, now what do I think of all this? I mean, I hope it doesn't sound like a cop out to say that. I mean, the Catholic tradition is at its best. It's a cliche, but it's true with these both ands. And I
Yeah.
really try to emphasize this with my students. So, like when we talk about Pascal and Arnaud, we did this thing on reception of communion. So, we have this culture now of, oh, daily, if you can daily mass, that's beautiful, that's great. Weekly reception. I say, okay, let's really think about this critique. Let's take seriously what Pascal and Arnaud are saying. So in our tradition, we have a balance, or we have a tension between mercy and inclusion, or universality, and justice, rigor, conversion. Okay. Neither can defeat the other. It's really bad if one of those poles, Congar talks about this as these poles of the church, in his case, with ecclesiology in particular. So we have to somehow find a way to uphold papal primacy. We cannot get rid of papal primacy. And I think the last 200 years, despite all the scandals and problems, have shown that you cannot be a global church without papal
Yeah.
primacy, not in any real way, with a real unity of faith or any kind of ecclesiastical jurisdiction or anything like that. So I'm not in any way anti-papal. I know some of your listeners aren't going to like this. I like Pope Francis. I also liked Papa Ratzinger. I liked Pope Benedict, and that freaked out some of my teachers who thought I must be some sort of crazy, reactionary because I like Ratzinger. I read the Introduction to Christianity. I was blown away by it. It's one of the best
Great
things I've
book.
ever. I
Great
thought,
book. Great, great. Wow.
why do all these people hate this guy? This is absolutely beautiful. So anyway, I feel enormous personal warmth towards the popes that I've known in my life, from a distance. On the other hand, uh, the papalization of the church, which I think is a phrase John O'Malley uses among others, did ride roughshod over some really gold standard Christian Catholic values that we see in Scripture, we see in the early church. So bishops are, and it's easy to say this when you like the bishop, but when you don't like the bishop, it's hard if you think he's corrupt or you think he's wacky.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
bishops are judges of the faith by divine right.
Absolutely.
And that we have any hope of any kind of ecumenical reunion with the Orthodox or with some of the Oriental Orthodox, with the Anglicans, the Lutherans. There is no way that we can return to the Church of Pius X or even some of the dynamics under John Paul II, who I think in his own head there was a tension of this, right? He writes Ut Unum Sint, which is this beautiful ecumenical reflection. But on the other hand, it can't become
Well, John, I'm going to stop a second. I mean, John Paul's a great
sure,
hero, a hero of mine. I mean, I entered the seminary the year he was elected, and I think what I say about John Paul is this: one of the greatest popes in the history of the church, despite mistakes he made, and he did make some big ones. One of the greatest popes in the history of the church, one of the most consequential popes in the history of the church, was in many ways simply a historical anomaly. I mean, he's just a
that's right.
25 plus year papacy. He was I think a kairos, a moment of the Holy Spirit that was so needed at that time vis-a-vis the Cold War, vis-a-vis global geo. He was a geopolitical pope. Let's put it that way. And this
Yes.
is
Yeah.
an
Yeah. Yeah.
underestimated aspect of his papacy. It led directly to some of his mistakes, which was a neglect of the governance of the church because his focus was so geopolitical in so many ways. So, in other words, yeah, I'm agreeing with you. At one and the same time, his papacy represented this magnificent breaking in of a genius, a charismatic man of monumental, historic, consequential proportions, but for that reason created a cult of personality, which
That's right.
only
Yeah.
increased this papolatry, this
That's right.
sense of
Yeah.
the papal is everything flows from the Pope, everything comes. And I'm not blaming John Paul for that. I'm simply saying this is he is a man of deep consequence, was a man of
That's
deep.
right.
And
Yeah.
as often happens with whether you're talking Napoleon or de Gaulle or Churchill or a Catholic Pope, when you are a man of historic consequence, there's going to be ripple effects for good and for ill. So that's
Yes.
my
Yeah.
take on
No
what you're
question.
saying. Anyway, so go ahead.
No, no, no. Absolutely right. I mean, I think there's a great transition when modern technology has completely transformed the papal office. The fact
Oh
that
yeah,
I could access, or one of my students could access, a papal encyclical on Twitter before maybe an elderly bishop would have it printed by someone in the chancery and handed to him. And so it's just a completely new situation, and we're going to have to keep reinventing ourselves. I know that sounds
we
really
are.
wonky, but to stay the same. I said this in an essay. I can't remember exactly what I said, but reflecting on this same dynamics you were describing of Ultramontanism and Vatican II. Somehow the Catholic Church has changed just enough to stay the same. And we need to keep doing that. We need to
Yeah,
keep flowing with the river and trying to find a way to balance legitimate local diversity, innovation, and creativity with uniformity and universality. And I know those all sound like platitudes. I don't know how to do that, but we can neither abandon that bishops are
yeah,
de jure divino successors of the
yes.
apostles, and that Jesus Christ willed in Peter a primacy.
I could not have said it better myself. I think we're at a historic moment where the church is going to remain itself, on its constitutive level, but it's going to also morph into something that we just right now can't even guess at.
That's right.
What we're seeing is, in a sense, the death throes of a certain form of Tridentine Baroque Catholicism that just doesn't really it just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah,
And which is why this Jansenist debate is so fascinating to me. Something new is being born. One of the reasons
I
why
agree.
I'm drawn to Dorothy Day isn't because I agree with absolutely everything she ever said or wrote, but I think she was essentially correct, and those who think like her are essentially correct. And I just read a great article from the theologian John Betts at Notre Dame, America's Notre
Yeah,
Dame, in the
yeah.
New Ressourcement Journal called The Analogy of Tradition, where he points out, similar to Dorothy Day, the church of the future is going to have to look like the Sermon on the Mount.
Hmm.
You know, that a radicalized living of the Sermon on the Mount,
Yeah.
however that gets translated into your state in life. And
Mhm.
that means also with terms of how we construct a hierarchical vision of the church vis-a-vis papacy, pope, and bishops and so forth. It's got to be patterned on the humility of the Sermon on the Mount. Betts points out, Paul in Philippians says, Christ did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at, but emptied himself, kenosis, and took on the form of a slave. The church needs to empty herself of a lot of the
Mm.
pomp of the divine prerogatives, the perfect society, and all that, and actually, I think, take on the form of the servant, take
Yeah.
on the form of the slave. But what does that mean? Those are nice words. Anyway,
Mm.
I'm
Mm.
soapboxing again. I'll give
Mm.
you the last word, Shaun.
Mm. Well, Larry, as always, I've just really enjoyed it. I feel like if I had enough coffee and time, I could talk to you for 10 hours, but I know we both need to move
Yeah.
on. But this just on the anthology, I just wanted to make clear. So I co-edited with Rick Yoder, my good friend and colleague, but also it was really a team of 15 or 16 folks doing translations. It's beginning in the 1630s, ending, I think the last text is 1809.
1809.
Um, we have a good kind of multicultural team, men and women, and it's from 7 different languages. So translations, many of them are French, but also Latin, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, German, and Arabic. There's actually an Arabic text as well.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough how important I think for Catholics who are concerned about the church and theological debates to understand the history of the church, to go back to the source documents. I mean, after all, I am a ressourcement theologian, but that doesn't mean just the church fathers and scriptures. It means a return to all of the sources of the faith, the entirety of the tradition. But that means a relecture of the tradition by understanding it historically. So this, if you're interested in this era, this very important post-Tridentine era of Catholicism, early modern Catholic sources, all right, Jansenism and International Anthology, edited by Shaun Blanchard and Richard Yoder. I cannot recommend it highly enough. I've been mesmerized. I had it with me in Rome, had it with me at Notre Dame. On the plane. I can't say I read it systematically. I was jumping all over the place.
Oh,
Uh,
good. Good.
you
Yeah.
know,
That's
you
what we
know,
hope. Yeah, that's great. And we want people to teach from it as well. People are always saying, hey, what's a good early modern source? And we've got women, uh, charismatic experiences, bishops arguing with kings and popes. So
Oh,
it's
you know
really,
what? This is a great point. This would make a great textbook if you were wanting to
yeah,
teach. If you're teaching a course on sort of post-Tridentine, Baroque era Catholicism, whatever, and the role of Jansenism and other issues, this would be a great book for that, a great
yeah,
source book.
yeah.
Well,
Great.
anyway, thank you so much, Shaun, for coming on the show today. And
Thank you,
obviously,
Larry.
I'll probably have you on again because in a lot of ways, we're just scratching the surface. But
Great. Thanks so much, Larry. I really enjoy it.
all right. And thanks again for everyone once again for listening. Bye now.